I'll just because some of us are new at it, but basically, um, basically, there are Mishnahs and there are Brisas and Toseftas. They're basically the oral tradition, the way it was written down in short, like as notes, and then the Gemara breaks it down. So what we're doing is methodically. It's not this. Some Gemaras they go off on one topic for pages. This is not this Gemara we're learning now. Is not doing that. The Gemara is quoting one. I think it's a Tosefta, like a brisa, a quote, and it just line by line explains. There's not a lot of debates. There's not a lot of things going off topic, and it's basically explaining the Karban Mincha. So let's get right into it. We're holding Daf Yudalid, the bottom of Daf Yudalid on the base, page 14b on the bottom. And we're holding the koimetz b'makim. We're holding 5 lines from the bottom, and we are discussing the oil that was put inside the meal offering. How did we get into this? Because we spoke about the meal offering that they would bring for the Sotah, for the suspected adulteress, but we were contrasting the suspected adulteress sacrifice with the standard meal offering sacrifice, and that's how we got into it. And we're talking all about the standard meal offering sacrifice. So let's go. So the Tosefta says that the kohen scoops out from the bowl of flour a 3-finger scoop, which I showed you. We spoke about this last week. And inside there was the part of flour that was saturated with oil. He makes a nice scoop out of this juicy flour with oil, and he puts it in another klisharis, another vessel from the temple. So he says, Minalon, where, and he just questions, some of the stuff is basic. How do you know it? Where do you come up with this from? How do you know that that's where he scoops it from? It says in the pasuk, Sotah, from its fine flour, umishamna, and from its oil. So the verse, if you look in the verse and the words in the pasuk, it says from the fine flour and the oil. Girsha. Girsha is barley that's ground fine barley, which was used. When did we bring a meal offering with barley? In 2 cases. We'll see soon in the Gemara. One is a suspected adulteress brought barley, and the other time it when? Very good, excellent. By the Karban Oimer is once a year they bring a barley meal offering. Excellent, Mitch umishamna. So then you'd bring the finely ground barley mishamna together with the oil. So that's the bottom line is. So you would you would scoop out with the 3 fingers, saturated with oil. Okay, the next part of the Tosefta kli. What would you do with the scoop? You'd put it into klishares, into the vessels of service, right? One of the service vessels in the temple. And you would sanctify it in the next vessel. The Gemara is going to have a question. I thought, didn't we learn in yesterday's Gemara that you made it holy by putting the whole flour before you even scooped it out, before you put the oil and everything in, just by sticking it in the original service vessel of the temple, the klisharis, you already made it holy. Why are you telling me that you scoop it out and stick it in another vessel and then it becomes holy? So the Gemara says, Lamali, why do you have to scoop it out and put it in a second vessel? Kitcha chada zimna. You already made it kaddish, you made it holy one time. By putting it in the first time, you put all the flour with the frankincense, with the oil. You made it holy. Why you have to scoop it out and put it in another vessel again? Why 2 times? And for the Gemara, and this is just a little overview here, midi dehavi adam, just like you do with blood. So what does that mean? There are this is good to know. Let me see if I can remember it correctly, hopefully, because I'm going to repeat it to you now. There are 4 main services that are done when you bring a korban. Does anyone know where it is? You guys can jump in and guess if you want. First part is with a regular korban, a sacrifice, shchita, you slaughter it. Second one is Kabbalah, you receive the blood of the neck into the first vessel it goes into. Then I think the word is Hagasha, you bring that blood, the kohen brings the blood in the cup to the altar. And then Zrika, you sprinkle the blood on the altar. And if that's not done by a kohen, everything's canceled and messed up. Those 4 are the main parts of the korban. Well, guess what? In a flour offering, there are also 4 main parts. The shchita of the knife, is the first time you put the flour into the vessel, because the knife is considered a vessel, a service vessel. Putting it into the first bowl, also it's a first service vessel. When you put it into the second service vessel, that's like when the blood from the neck goes into the cup. That's a second service vessel. So same thing here too. That just like by blood, dam afal gav. Even though the kadishte sakin, that the knife was mekadesh, the knife made the korban holy, because you did a service already with the korban by slaughtering it with the knife, which belonged to the Beis Hamikdash, which was a service vessel, but tzavar behema, with the neck of the animal. Nevertheless, it's not enough to do one sanctification of the animal with the shchita knife, with the ritual slaughter knife. Hadar, he returns and mekachele with bishares, and then sanctifies the blood again in the service vessel by receiving the blood from the neck into the service vessel. Achanami, here too, loishna, we don't differentiate, and also you got to have a double service vessel service. First, you put all the flour into one big bowl, then you scoop it out and you put it into a second big bowl, completing the action of two service vessels are done by a regular sacrifice, and so too, by a regular animal sacrifice, so too by a meal offering. Okay, then if you remember, we said that the scoop, we taught this last week, has to be perfect, not missing one crumb, has to be scoop out exactly 3 fingerfuls of flour. Perfectly fitting. It's very complicated. The Kohen had to go to Kohen school and practice very hard how to do it. He had to make sure that there was not, we learned last week, a drop of salt or anything else inside there, including the frankincense. So he would push aside all the frankincense, all the spices, and he would scoop out the flour saturated with oil, and then he would take back the frankincense, the levina, and he would put it back in later on after he did the scoop, making sure the scoop was perfect with perfection, was not missing anything. Then he added the levina all back inside. Let's see. This is what the Tosefta says. And you collect the frankincense after you pushed it to the side to scoop. But when you put it on top, back onto the scoop that you just did. And how do we know? Where do I know that from? Fine. The verse says, and all the levina, all the frankincense, the spices, asher ala mincha, that's on the mincha, has to be burnt together. So first you scoop it out, you make sure it's nowhere near your scooping. Then you go back, you take the frankincense, you put it back on top of the new scoop. All of the frankincense, because it all has to be burnt when it's burnt in the mizbecha, like we'll see in a second. What do you do with it? Umaleu. Now, what do you do with everything? You put it up, daf tetzvav, back on the next page, umaktirai, and you burn it and you sacrifice it, b'kli shares, in the service vessel. You bring it up and you dedicate it with in the service vessel. So the Gemara says what? The Gemara says, and I'm going to just read it according to Rashi's pshat. Rashi's confused because before, the way Rashi is going to learn this is that you always salt it. You always, every korban, every sacrifice you bring, it's a very interesting rule in the Beis Hamikdash, always needs to have a good salt, a lot of salt on it. Very interesting Gemara. It talks about when Hashem divided the upper waters and the lower waters. I don't know if you guys remember that Rashi. The lower waters were upset that they weren't before Hashem, and Hashem says, don't worry, the salt which comes from the ocean will always be put on the Mizbeach, it'll always be before me. So all karbanis, the bottom line is that's why we dip the challah in salt on Shabbos, because our bread is like a korban, and korban always had salt on it. So Rashi's saying, wait, how do you say that you right away bring Bikli Sharis Makterle? What, right away, before the salt, you put it right away to sacrifice it, to bring it as an offering on the Mizbeach? What happened to the salt? So he says, no, don't worry, no, we mean to say, Maleyu Bikli Sharis Laktiroi, you bring it up in the service vessel in order, because you're going to offer it on the Mizbeach, on the altar. And then you salt it, and then before you pour the flour with the salt and the frankincense in the fire, you salt it, and then you put it on the fire. So don't worry, we're going to put it on the fire after the salted, because everything, just like you dip your challah, unless it's like Rosh Hashanah, which you do the honey, you make sure to have the salted. The Ksiv, it says, where do we know in the Torah that it says that all karbanos need to have salt? Very interesting. This is why we dip our salt in the challah on Shabbos. The chol carbon and all karbanos. This is quoted from the Torah. Minchasta of your Meal offering, even by melach timlach, has to be salted. You should pour salt always on everything, including your meal offerings. Okay. Now, remember, there's a whole bowl left of flour. You only took a 3-finger scoop out of it. What happens to the rest? So so we said in the Tosefta, karav hakoimetz. Once you offer bring close and you offer the kmitza, the scoop, shiara nachalim, the rest are eaten by the kohen. And by the way, when the kohanim eat the carbon, that brings the remainders, that brings forgiveness to the owner. They have to have intent. That's why it's important for the kohanim to eat it. So too here, on part of the kohen's diet wasn't just steak and steak and steak, but they also had flour, because one of the things that they got is also the remainder of the flour offerings they ate. So the Gemara says, Minalon, well, how do you know that? Just going through everything quickly, where does the source from the Torah? Imagine like learning the mitzvahs. And he says, well, where do you know that mitzvah from the Ksiv, like it says in the verse, the Hikter HaKoyen, and the Kohen offers it, as karasa, as a remembrance. The Kohen offers it as a remembrance on the altar. And the Ksiv, and then right away after, what does the verse say? And what's left over from the mincha, from the meal offering, the Aaron Ulevana, that's a gift to Aaron and his sons. So once you bring Hashem his part, same thing with the sacrifices, the Kohanim get to have their part. A Karav HaKoimetz. Now he says, and the Gemara here gets very technical sometimes, and usually in life things run smooth, but not always. The question now the Gemara is going to ask like a technical question, like it'll ask a lot. Well, how burnt does the kemitza, does the scoop have to be? Like, what if the kohanim are rushing to eat the flour? How long do you have to wait? Till it's fully burnt, till it's a little burnt. It's a little machlokes over here. Lamar kidde islay, to the master, to one of the rabbis, as he says. Ulamar, to the other one, kidde islay, as he says. It's a debate. It's a debate. When you could start eating the flour, the itma, because we learned, hakoimetz, that the kemitza, the scoop, me'imase, from when matir, does it allow shirayim b'achila, the leftovers, to be eaten? Right? When are you allowed to eat the leftovers? So it's a machlokes, it's a debate. Rabbi Chanina says, mishatishloit boy ha'ur. As soon as the fire touches it, you're good. You just, the kohen puts on the scoop on the thing. All right, party. Everybody could go now. Whoever's kohen wants to have their breakfast now, wants to have, what do they eat? Whatever they want to eat. What do they make malawach or whatever they call that stuff? You know, you want to make a nice wrap out of it, a nice matzah out of it. No problem. It just has to touch the fire. You're good to go. Let the fire just start burning it. Rabbi Chanina argues. He says, only once the fire burnt the majority. It's good. It's in the fire. It's already burnt the majority of it in the fire. Then you're allowed. So machlokes here. One machlokes here today so far about exactly when is the time that it becomes allowed for one to eat, when the kohanim are allowed to eat the leftovers. Okay. Now, here comes the next question. Well, what could they eat it with, right? Can they mix it? I actually asked Yisrael today about his pizza. I told him I wanted to be mezainis, so he should make flour, he should make fruit juice in his pizza. Whatever the halachically way that it's allowed, maybe if I eat a little bit of pizza, it would be, just a little piece, it'll be okay. So he says, no, it doesn't taste good. Only water in the pizza. It doesn't taste good with doing it to mezainis. So here, but the kohanim in the Beis Hamikdash, by the way, everything had to be not chametz free. Everything, I don't know if you guys know this, for those that are learning about the sacrifices still in the beginning, everything in the Beis Hamikdash had to be chametz free. It had to be pesachdik. Not just what you brought as a sacrifice, even what the kohanim ate. And they're enjoying the food. I think it even says from the commentaries, they sat and they ate their food over there. They had to eat it in a prestigious way. In a good meal, it was part of the forgiveness for the person who brought the sacrifice or to fulfill the purpose and the mission of the korban. And could they eat it? Oh, they had to eat it like matzah. So let's see. V'rashoyin, the kohanim are allowed litin l'toichet, to put into it yayin. They can mix wine into the mixture. V'shemen, they can put even oil in, make a nice juice. The oil adds a lot of juiciness to the matzah. Udvash, and even put honey inside of it. Could even put honey inside of the thing. Now, it's still not allowed to be chametz. Fruit juice makes flour come chametz faster. They still have to make sure it doesn't come chametz, but within the 18 minutes or within whatever time it doesn't become chametz, you're allowed to add, the kohanim could add flavor. They didn't have to just eat the whole time dry flour and water. They could add wine, oil, and honey. My time is the Gemara. Why? How do we know that the kohanim could spice it up and make this like a nice royal juicy bread, matzah? Amar Kra, the verse says l'mashcha to for distinction, the gdula to prestigious, like a king's table, like a fancy meal. Kederach sham alachem oisin has to be a term used to distinction, like the kings eat it, so the kehanim would be able to cook it within the chametz limit, but they would eat it to distinction. They would have to eat it nicely on chashav, and that would be part of their diet. That would be part of their meal. Okay. However, as I said, ve'ein asurun ela melachmitz, the only regulation on this bread is that we mentioned is that it cannot become chametz. So nothing in the Beis Hamikdash is allowed to become chametz. The only time they had was the chalas and shvuas. Even the bread, I think, the 12 breads that they had on the bread table, nothing in the Beis Hamikdash. It's just interesting to learn about this stuff that it couldn't be chametz. The ksiv, like the verse says, you shouldn't bake it. The chametz, even their position, even though it's not on the sacrifice, it's being brought as Hashem, it's the remainder, that also is not allowed to become chametz. Okay. Reb Shimon ben Lakish, and Reb Shimon ben Lakish explains the verse to me, even their portion, should not be baked into chametz. All right, and that's the end of the Shtickle Gemara so far. Let's go on. All the mincha offerings. So he said like this. What did he say? He said, listen, all the meal offerings are different than the Sotah offering, right? That all the meal offerings, you put on oil, you put on frankincense. It should be nice. You bring a gift to Hashem. But the carbon Sotah, as the Gemara is going to say later on, she acted like an animal, so her sacrifice is like an animal. Don't put on the flour. Don't put on the oil. You know, this one carbon don't make it fancy. This woman who's a suspected adulteress, don't do what you do to the other sacrifices. Don't put it on. Make it as low class as possible. No oil, no frankincense. And the Gemara is going to question this. How could you say that? We know there's another carbon which we don't want it to look classy either and rich either, which is the flour offering of a sinner. We also tell you don't bring frankincense and don't bring oil. So how come our Tosefta here is telling us that the only one, it almost seems like the only one that you don't put frankincense and oil on is the suspected adulteress, but also a meal offering for a sinner. So too, we don't want it to be pretty and we don't want to put on those frankincense and oil. So he's going to question that. Are you saying that all other, besides the suspected adulteress, all other meal offerings get the oil and the frankincense? How could you say that? Well, but there is minchas chayta, the meal offering of a sinner. For certain sins, you bring this thing, whatever. I think maybe for violating impurity in the temple, whatever it was. The Rachmana Amar, Rachmana means the Torah says, Hashem says, the merciful one says, La Yasim Allah Hashem, and even that meal offering, you don't put oil. Even on that one, don't put frankincense. So almost if you just take it in black and white, the statement that this Sefta said, we're very confused because he's setting down the rules. He's saying there's only one sacrifice that you don't put on oil or frankincense, but there's more than one. What are you saying? The Gemara says, no, you're right, but just read it like this. He's going to kind of, a lot of it was like notes. It was written in very shorthand, so you have to explain. This is the way to read it. And he's going to explain both sacrifice, you don't put on oil, and frankincense. And this is the correct way to read it, as the Gemara often explains. How do you read this stuff? All meal offerings generally to unais required to go with them shaman. You have to put on all general meal offerings, oil, ulavina, and the frankincense. And most of them come uvais minachitin. Almost all the meal offerings come from wheat flour. Uvais silas, and on top of that, not just any wheat flour, but high grade sifted, not whole grain, but very thinly sifted flour. However, minchas chayta, first of all, the sin offerings, sacrifice, meal offering, if it's a sin offering. Remember, these are you're learning now the exclusions for when we don't do the full service on the meal offering. Even though the sinner sacrifice, meal offering, doesn't get oil and frankincense. Nevertheless, it still gets, you still use wheat like wheat. And the wheat still has to be high grade wheat. It has to be very finely grained, finely ground. However, so it's, in other words, you're right, on the sin offerings, you don't put oil and frankincense, but you still have to use wheat and you still have to ground it nice and thin. Minchas oimer. Then on the other hand, so in other words, you don't do two things to it, but you keep two things standard. You don't do on the sinner's offering, you don't do oil and frankincense, but you still use wheat and you grind it nicely. Now, what about the minchas oimer, like Mitch told us before, about the meal offering that was brought the second day of Pesach to allow you to start eating grains, even though shehiba minas oir, and that comes from barley, you use now a different kind of a grain, you use barley. Tu'una, still, there's barley, tu'una shemen, it still needs oil, ulavina, and frankincense. You got to make it nice. It's not a sin offering. Uba geresh, and it also has to be ground nicely. So, which kind of makes sense, because it's not a sin offering and it's not a suspected adulterous offering. You're right, you're not using wheat, you're using barley for whatever reason, but you're still grinding it up nicely and you're still bringing the oil and the frankincense. But this, the suspected adulteress, is the worst of all of them. Eina tuna loy shemen, it first of all doesn't get not oil. V'loy levayna, and it doesn't get frankincense. Uva min asoir, and on top of it, it's barley. Uva kemach, and it comes, I believe that means that it doesn't come finely ground, it comes whole grain. So the suspected adulteress is different than all of the sacrifices, that it doesn't have all four of those uniquenesses. And there you go. We have, it's very interesting. You have the overview, the Gemara, of all the different kinds of meal offerings and different standards that's within them. Okay, very interesting. Tanya, we learned in a Braisa. Okay? Reb Shimon says, and here's going to be an interesting Gemara. You're gonna learn a statement. Let's see in a second. The din really, it should have been Ushetehei minchas chayta to una shemen levayna. Really, he says the sin offerings, meal offering should have really had oil and frankincense. Why? What's his logic that it should have had it? Very simple reason. Shlo yehei chayta niskar. This is a famous statement in the Gemara for those of you that are new to Gemara. So a sinner shouldn't be rewarded. You're a sinner. Why should you get rewarded? You should pay at least as much as the other guy. Right? So you shouldn't, in other words, because you're a sinner, your meal offering should be cheaper. No, go buy the oil and buy the thing. So really, in theory, he says, you should have really had to pay at least, and the cost of your meal offering should have been no less than any other meal offering. Why doesn't it require to have the additional parts to it? Because we don't want your carbon to be beautiful. So in other words, from a financial perspective, for sure you should have, theoretically, for sure you should have been required to bring all the parts and make you pay the full amount because you sinned. But because we don't want it to be beautiful, we said no. We did, and also, same thing, theoretically, really, that when you bring a sin offering, a meal, an animal, and most sin offerings, a very standard sin offering back in the day was chelev, for fats, because you couldn't distinguish between kosher fats and non-kosher fats. So people mistakenly would eat the non-kosher fats, which is a severe punishment, which I think on purpose is kares. It's a very severe punishment. So when you do it by mistake, you now have to bring a korban. You have to bring a sacrifice. Ask Hashem forgiveness. I'm sorry. I went to the butcher and I thought I ate kosher fats and I ate the non-kosher. Which fats is allowed from which animal? It depends which animal. It depends. It's complicated and they can't distinguish between one fat and another fat. And therefore, I'm sorry, bring a korban. Tu'una nesachim, really you should have to bring libations because on animals, just like by flour, you had to bring additional items. By animals also, you had to always bring wine, yayin, and whatever, what else was there? Oil, I guess, was together with it. So why do you not bring it? And why should you theoretically have to bring the additional libations? Niskar, so the sinner shouldn't benefit, they can pay just as much as any other guy bringing a sacrifice needs the extra libations, pay for that extra bottle of wine that has to go with it. Why shouldn't he have to do it? Why do you not require him to bring the extra fancy additional gifts with the sin offering. So a sacrifice shouldn't be beautiful. So again, we want your carbon to look for the sin that was done, and therefore don't spice it up with the extra bottle of wine that comes along with it. However, the sin offering of the Mitzayra, there's two other sin offerings that we want to talk about now. A guy who was a leper, after he finished his period of leprosy, he needs to bring us a carbon, v'ashamai, and his asham offering. He brings a asham and a chatos. He has to bring different. The guy broke out leprosy, and now when he's done his leprosy to become pure again, he has to bring sacrifices. How come over there, Tunin Nesachim, you do come along with the extra libations with them? You're bringing a sin offering and a guilt offering. Why does the leper bring it along? And for the Gemara, because the sacrifices that a leper brings is not considered a sin offering. The Gemara says, Eini, is that the case? But Amar Reb Shmuel bar Nachmani talks for a second about a leper. Didn't Reb Shmuel, the son of Nachmani, say, Amar Reb Yonas and Emre Reisanem, why do people break out with leprosy without getting into that whole Gemara now? Al Shiva Dvarim, the Goyim Boyin, the Gemara says that for 7 things a person breaks out with leprosy. For Lashon Hara is one of them, gossip, Shvichas Damim for murder, for using God's name in vain, for somebody who steals. These people break out of leprosy. So when they bring a sin offering at the end of the leprosy, why are you telling me that's not for a sin? And he brings libations. A leper is a sinner. And for the Gemara, Hassam over there, you know why the sacrifice brought by a leper at the end is not a real sin offering? Hassam there, minigehudi the kaperle, the blemishes he had, that already brought him forgiveness. You want to know what forgives a leper for the sin of, let's say, speaking Lashon Hara, for gossiping? He already suffered his consequences. His sacrifice was the fact that he got leprosy was his thing. So why does a leper need to bring a carbon if he already suffered his consequences, punishment? Kimaisi carbon, when he brings a sacrifice, it's only because to allow him to now eat holy sacrifices again. So to clean him up because he was impure. So the sacrifice is because the leper was impure. The leprosy is for what he did wrong. So therefore, since the sacrifice is not for what he did wrong, the leprosy was for what he did wrong. The sacrifice, very interesting, is to allow him now to become pure again. If so, he can bring the libations that go together with it. So the Gemara says, Elamayata, okay, whoa, hold on a second. Let me challenge this. What about Chatas Nazir, the sin offering of a Nazirite? When a person, takes on an oath of being a Nazir, that he's going to let his hair grow long, he's not going to eat wine, he's not going to go to a cemetery. He also brings a sin offering. And guess what's very interesting now? To Tuna Nesachim, that should require libations, and it doesn't. Why would so we're trying to be very clear. If I did a sin, then it doesn't get libations. A leper, okay, the sacrifice is because he was impure. Well, what about a guy who took on an oath to be a Nazir, a Nazirite, and he brings a sacrifice? Once we're on this discussion, why doesn't his sacrifice have the libations, the extra gifts with it? Very interesting answer the Gemara says. And this is part of the question, because it's also not coming for a sin. He didn't do a sin. I thought if it's not a sin offering, you bring libations. The Gemara answers it is a sin offering. A very interesting, famous answer. He holds like Rabbi Elazar HaKapper. The Amar says, Nazir nami chaytahu. The Nazirite's a sinner. What sin did the Nazirite do? He took on himself to be holier, not to go to a cemetery, because he also did something wrong. Although he took on himself to be holier, he decided not to partake in the gifts Hashem gave, not to partake in wine. And Hashem doesn't really like people abstaining for things that are permitted, and therefore it's a partial sin. It's a beautiful idea, this message here, by the way, is that in life, we should not be too religious. You should not take on what Hashem allows you to do, you should do and you should enjoy. And even though we're saying the Nazir was a very high person, but he sinned. It's a famous idea here that a person should not, what Hashem allows you and tells you to partake, you have to elevate it, your mission in this world. Who gives you a right to do it, to abstain? So here Hashem gives you a right, but you still, very interesting, have to bring korban chatos. a sin offering because you also did something that's not 100% right, and that's why that carbon doesn't have the libations, because that carbon is a sin offering, because in a sense you did something that wasn't fully right. See Rashi here, Shetzir Atzmim in Ayayin, he pained himself on the wine, and therefore it's not allowed. Okay, so Rabbi Gamliel says, Kishem. This is the last piece of Gemara on this Sotah that we're going to start in the mission in a moment. What was this talking about? Hold on one second, guys. Right, we spoke about that. We said that really the woman should have to bring the Sotah, the suspected adulteress, should have to pay. She should pay for the frankincense and the oil, because we don't want it to look like a nice sacrifice. Therefore, we're going to tell her, don't put the oil and don't put the frankincense on it, and even do barley. So this is where it comes from another famous shtickle about it. We learned that Rabbi Gamliel said to the Chachamim, Seifrim, scribes, rabbis, hinichuli, leave this to me. Let me vadar shenu.
Oh, Mitchell's on the phone.
And I will explain it. Kimin choimer, that there was a like a jewel. I'll explain it. Choimer is like a jewel. Leave it to me and I'll explain it like a jewel. This explanation of the Sotah, that she doesn't put it, that it's barley and so on. The Shami, the mayor that he heard, the Ka'amah that he says, why does she have to bring barley? She gave him to eat the most delicious delicacies of the world to seduce him. Therefore, her sacrifice is the food of a behema, an animal. So we want it to be, why? Because it's very interesting. Everything else is wheat. Why is this barley? Okay, so he says, I'll tell you why. Because they were eating together fancy foods, so now we're going to have them eat animal foods, because barley is usually what you give to animals to eat. Amalai. So he says, wait a second. Hatina Chashira, that's if she was a wealthy woman, that they were going to fancy restaurants and in order to do the prohibited things. Ania, but what about a poor person? She didn't give him fancy foods that you're saying now eat animal food. My Kamemar, what are you going to say? Shame that just like her actions were acting like a behemoth. A human being is truthful to their spouse. Animals are not committed and dedicated to their spouse. Kach karbana, so to her sacrifice is Michael behema, is the food of a behema, is the food of an animal, and that's why this carbon is because you're nice. The carbon is something that's very complicated, but it's very geschmack when there's a svara, when there's a reason behind it. So therefore, it's very geschmack. And very enjoyable, and that's specifically why barley is eaten by animals, and she acted like an animal by not being true to her spouse, and therefore her sacrifice will be a sacrifice of an animal. And that's why it's specifically barley. Very interesting. Zakti Mishnah, let's go on. A new Mishnah, beautiful. Zakti Mishnah. So we're going back to the suspected adulteress story. She would bring. Where am I here? 1 second. Sorry, guys. She would bring an earthenware vessel, piyali shachares, a vessel that's made out of earthenware. We're going to talk about the concoction. How is the concoction made that would magically be the DNA test of those days, or not DNA test, whatever the test, to see if she really anything happened between him and her, the magical potion. So she would bring a vessel of earthenware. And into the vessel would go chatzi lug mayim, a half a lug of water. This is the potion, how it's made. Where would they get the water from? Very interesting. Mina kiyar, from the kiyar. The kiyar is the wash basin, one of the important parts of furniture in the temple. I believe it's the last one that the Torah describes in the Mishkan, that they had a place where the Kohanim would wash their hands and feet, just like the Levim washed the Kohanim's hands. I guess it's probably commemorating this idea that the Kohanim, before they would work in the temple every day, they would wash it from the kiyar. So they would go over to that wash basin and they would fill up a half a lug of water from there into this earthenware vessel. Okay? Following, this is how the potion is made. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Rabbi Yehuda says that it wasn't a half a lug, it was a revius, it was a fourth of a lug. So it's a debate, was it a half or a fourth? The Mishnah is very interesting. Why are they arguing if it was a half or a fourth? Because these same rabbis argue how much of the scroll needs to be erased into the water. And the words and the letters that they argue about there is also half or a quarter. In other words, it's the same size. So depending how much liquid you need to erase the letters into the water, that's why they argue. If you're wondering why is it a half a lug or a quarter of a lug, because they debate how much ink is there that needs to be erased. Geshem, just like Shemamai Piksav, Rabbi Yehuda says there's less writing that's erased. So too, based exactly on the amount of writing that's erased, he's saying there needs to be less water because you don't need as much water in order to erase it into. Okay, now what happens? Nichnas lehecho, and you have an earthenware vessel with water from the kior, and you go into the heichel, into the courtyard, and you turn to the right. And there was a place there, Amma, that was one cubit by a cubit, and there was a marble stone. So if I understand correctly, the floor was covered by tiles, and there was a tile. I guess they weren't walking on the mud. There was a tile floor in the heichel, and they would go over to the tile. V'tabas hoysakavuba, and in that tile, that marble tile, was a tabas, was a ring that was attached to it. Shumagbia, when you would lift it up, the noitel offer metachteha, and take dirt from under the tile, the noisna, and you put dirt from the floor of the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan, into your earthenware vessel. The noisna, and you put in there enough dirt that it should be sticking out. You should see the dirt. In other words, it shouldn't be fully covered by water, but you should be able to spot. Don't put a tiny drop of dirt in there. Put enough dirt that you can see the dirt sticking out. Alamayim, sticking out over the water. Shanema, like it says. How do I know? Again, another pasuk. I'm going to offer, and from the dirt, that will be in the floor of the Mishkan. The Torah says, get the dirt from the floor of the Mishkan. Yikach HaKoyin, the Kohen shall take Manasan Alamayim, and he should put it into the water. Okay? So far, we have water from the kior, from the wash basin, and we have dirt from the floor. Interesting how the concoction's made. We're going to learn about it. What happens once they stop digging? Where do they get more dirt? We'll learn in the Gemara right now. I was going to explain a little bit till the end of this page, and we're going to start at the beginning of the next page. Let's go on. Tana, we learned Piyale Shalcheres Chadash. Number one, this vessel, this earthenware vessel, has to be new. You have to have a new, can't bring an old used vessel. Has to be a new vessel. David Rabbi Yishmael, so is the words of the scholar Rabbi Yishmael. Now, okay, where do you make that up from? Where do you get that from? The Gemara wants to know, my timer, the Rabbi Yishmael, what's Rabbi Yishmael's reason that it has to be a new vessel? So we're going to learn something called Agzeira Shava. A lot of stuff in the Torah is learned like this, that if we have a word used in one scenario and an identical word used in another scenario, we know the Torah is giving it to us to compare. And it was passed in tradition. You got to compare these two words. So he's going to tell you why. Gomar, we learn. Kli, vessel from vessel. You're using the word keli here to talk about your earthenware vessel. Well, we know it from elsewhere. Where do we have an earthenware vessel which we made another potion? The Mitzayra, from the leper. Right? When you see the story there, you put in there the crimson wool. Remember, and the Rabbi Chazara talks about it. I probably in the speech. It's famous that you put a piece of cedar when that you should learn humility, made a concoction. Over there, it says it has to be a vessel, and we have the word kli, and here we have the word kli. Ma'alahala and cheres chadas, just like by the Mitzayra, by the leper, it's telling you got to use a kli, and it's talking about an earthenware vessel that's new. Afkan, here too also cheres chadasha. It has to be a new earthenware vessel. So we have one potion that's made of the vessel, another one uses the same word, just like over there, it's earthenware new. Also here, it has to be new too. So the Gemara says, wait a second, the Hasamedalin, where do you know it there? Fine, let's go over there now. Where do you know that the guy, by the Mitzayra, by the leper, it has to be an earthenware vessel? Because the pasuk says, the verse says, how do we know it here? by the leper. You slaughter the bird. There's two birds there. One you send away to fly away, and one you slaughter and you put the blood inside this potion. They're going to end up sprinkling the potion on like the guy's earlobe, if you remember, on the toe, the big toe, wherever they sprinkle the leper's water. But they slaughter the bird. Ha'achas, one of the two birds. Al kli cheres, and the blood goes into the vessel. Al mayim chayim, into the mayim chayim. You ever heard of the word mayim chayim? Living waters. And why? And there it's comparing the vessel by the leper to living waters. Ma mayim chayim, just like the waters are living waters. What does that mean, living waters? What does it mean, they're alive? No. That no work was done with them. It has to be fresh, new water, not that you use for something else. Avkli, so to the vessel that the water is going into, the Torah is telling us, cannot be a vessel that was used. So again, by the leper, following the steps here. How do we know all this? By the leper, the Torah compares new water, unused water, in a vessel, meaning that also we're learning, it's comparing the two in the verse, the vessel to the water, meaning the vessel has to be new. And then we're learning kli from the Mitzayra vessel, the leper vessel, to the Sotah, to the suspected adulterous vessel, that it also has to be new. Okay? So the Gemara says, wait a second, if you're using a Gzeir Shava learning system, which means a comparative word, Imala, if so, compare it all the way. Now I have a different shaila, a different question for you. Imala halan mayim chayim. If, just like over there, the water has to be fresh water, unused water, right? Afkan, mayim chayim, make the comparison fully extended across the board, that the water by this suspected adulteress also has to be mayim chayim. And you just told me that where does the water come from over here? From the wash basin. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yishmael hachinami, no problem. Why do you think the water in the kiyar, in the wash basin, wasn't new water, fresh spring water? Or well, whatever water that wasn't used. Rabbi Shmuel actually says that. He says that the water in the kiyar, in the wash basin, was good, not used water. Rabbi Yochanan says, "May kiyar." Rabbi Yochanan says, what kind of water was in? It's an interesting question on its own. Where did the water in the wash basin come? What kind of water was it? Shmuel says, mayanheim. They're water from a spring. So yes, it's fresh spring water that's there. So it's not a problem. The water by the leper has to be fresh spring water. The water by the Sotah, yes, he'll agree it has to be fresh spring water. And if he fills it up from the wash basin, it'll be fresh spring water. However, the Chachamim, there's a debate on this, say that the kiyar water is mishar, maybe saying could be from other waters, doesn't have to be from fresh, unused spring water, and therefore it's a debate. But according to the guy we're learning, the rabbi, Rabbi Shmuel, the one that we're learning over here, holds that it's identical. The leper has to be a new vessel, a new water, fresh water, and so too by the suspected adulteress too. So the Gemara says doesn't want to stay with that, doesn't like, again, what question did we have that we started here from? Our Mishnah said it has to be a new earthenware vessel, and we said, who told you that? I'm sorry, Rabbi Shmuel was the one who said, yeah, we said it has to be, our Mishnah here said, Rabbi Shmuel said it has to be a new vessel, and we said, who told you that? You said, oh, I learned it out from the leper. Well, the Gemara can say, Ikla Mifrach, well, I don't know if that's such a good idea to learn from the leper vessel to our vessel by the suspected adulteress, because there's differences between them. By the case of the leper, Shekain Ton, we know that potion needs a lot of other stuff. Eitz erez, in the concoction has to go a cedar wood, a piece of cedar wood, ve'ezoiv, and a hyssop grass, ushni seilas, and a crimson wool, a reddish wool piece, has to go in there. So don't tell me that we're comparing. I don't like your comparison. Like, you could disagree if the comparison is legit or not, because if it was true that was passed down in tradition that these two things are identical, then the potions would be similar too, and that one has to have all this extra stuff that's not in the suspected adulteress. So no, let's find another way. Let's find a different way to learn how we know that it has to be a new vessel, a new earthenware vessel. So Amar Rabba says, simply because Amar Kra, the verse says, by the suspected adulteress, Bekli Cheres, it should be in an earthenware vessel, like the earthenware vessel. In other words, it's obvious. The earthenware vessel, we already spoke about an earthenware vessel by a leper. So if I'm talking about the earthenware vessel again, I don't need to explain. It's Bikli Cheres, it's in it's not in it's not like it's kind of not introducing the vessel again. It's not saying an earthenware that's a vessel. It's saying no, bikli in that vessel that's earthenware that we already used in the base of English for something else. That kind of a vessel we use it for a leper. But kli shamar t'l'chakvar, from the way the Torah writes it, it's showing it's the vessel that we already spoke about once before. Where else did we spoke about that someone made a potion in a vessel, wasn't an earthenware new vessel? So to here, I'm talking about that vessel, that set of dishes that we were talking about elsewhere already in the Gemara. That's how he knows it. Okay, so that's the bottom line. That we learned that the vessel, that was the Shiloh. We just mentioned the quick statement that it has to be a new vessel. And he says yes, because when you say earthenware vessel, it's the standard earthenware vessel that we spoke about before, which also had to be new. But the Gemara says, as always gets into details, well, how new? Does it mean it has to be like brand new that never used, or it has to look new? So Amar Rava says, Leishana, we didn't learn Ella Shaloi. This Akmupana, Rava says it's only that its face wasn't blackened. It doesn't have to be brand new. It has to can't look like an old used vessel, because in those days, earlier vessels, they would put them on the fire and it would get black from the fire. So as long as it's not black, it doesn't have to be spanking brand new. It just has to look like a new vessel looks. But if it's an old vessel, Sulin, it is possible, it's no good. So the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? That the vessel has to be clean and new and fresh, because we want the vessel to be similar to the water. And it mamayim, just like water, that the colors of the water didn't change. The water is not kosher if the water's changed color. So to the vessel has to be a vessel that the vessel did not change color. But by the way, this is just an interesting halacha. There's a shaila, like if you could wash negelwasser, use a mikvah, I don't know, whatever. Actually, mikvah, I think it could have different colors and stuff. There, I remember learning the Lachs and the Rambam, but negelwasser is a lot of shailas if it could be changed color or so on. It has to look like water. It can't be changed color. So just like the water has to be as that the halachis have to look like clean water, the vessel it goes into has to look like a clean vessel. Okay, so that's how we finished this topic here so far of the vessel looking. We're almost done. But Rav asked the question. But he's going to ask a different question. And we're not done yet, actually. Here's one last point. Because Gemara always wants to know what happens if nisakmu, if it turned black, and you put it back and like to the kiln. And became white. Aha! It was an old vessel. Then, but you made it look new. Mahu, is it? Me, I'm reading. Do we say? And this is like a standard Gemara, often Gemara question like the style. Kivan the adchu idachu. Once it was pushed away, it's blackened. Pushed away from being used as a service vessel, it's pushed away and that's it. Once it's gone, can never be brought back. Or do we say, Kivin the haduri hadur, since it's returned, we can return it. So that's a shaila, and what's the answer? So this is like a standard Gemara question. It could be asked. This logic could be asked in many other cases. When you're saying I'm not allowed to use something once it's been disqualified, can I requalify it again? So the Gemara says, well, let me try to find an answer to this question. Tashma coming here from somewhere else. Another halacha, Rebbe Lazar says, with those things that are needed for the leper concoction, right? Eitz erez, a cedar wood branch, ve'ezav, or a hyssop grass, or shnisei, so the crimson wool, she'eshpil bahen kupasai. You needed to borrow, you needed a piece of rope, and you hung your box, your suitcase, with a rope. Behind your back, you went and you needed to go on a long rope, and you borrowed this wool, and now you want to use it for the leper concoction. The Mishnah says, Sulin, it's possible, it's no good, it's disqualified. You use the rope for other things. Sorry, you cannot use it for a sacrifice now for the potion that's needed to be made. So let's learn from here that once something's been disqualified, it's done. Even if you fix it, even if you rearrange it, once it's been disqualified for use in the temple to make a potion, you cannot use it anymore. So maybe that should answer our question about the old earthenware vessel that was turned to new. How could you compare? Hadri umifshiti, over there you could re-straighten it. You could, hasam. I'm sorry. In our case of in a case where you could fix it, it's completely new. But hasam there, iklufe, it was peeled, and that, in other words, don't learn a proof from there. It could be because when they use the material incorrectly, it got peeled. And therefore, it messed it up. You used it too incorrectly. You messed it up, and therefore there's no solution. So you have no proof to your question, your standard question in the Gemara about something that was disqualified and requalified again. Don't bring a proof from this scenario. That scenario, you completely misused it, and therefore it's not okay for it to be used again. But you don't have an answer to if a vessel was old, that you made it new, if that's allowed to be used or not. Okay. This next two lines, a famous Gemara here, a famous idea in the Gemara, Nichnas lahechal. But first quoting our Mishnah, when you walked into the Heichal, into the Beis HaMikdash, Upana, the Yamina, you turned to your right. You walked into the courtyard and you turned right to go to the cubit by cubit tile to lift it up. Now, it was to your right, but they built it on the right so that you should walk to the right. My time, what's this thing? Walk in and go to your right. Because we say any place a person turns. This is a famous line here. Should only always be to the right. From this, a lot of halachas and things that we do is that we always go to the right. For example, lighting the Hanukkah candle. We start with the new one, but we go right. And there was a famous one, the Shabbos. The guy almost from Australia almost walked to the left when he came down. You have to walk to the right when you bring the Sefer Torah back, Mitch, right? You got to walk to the right.
100%.
Yeah. Also, what else? When the scribe writes, he writes the letter from the corner down. He goes from left to the right. So basically, that is the idea of always turn to your right. Whenever we don't know where to go because Waze is not working. They always say, I don't know if it always works, but always say, make a right. It comes from this line over here that the Gemara brings, called Pina Shata Poina, all turns that you turn, should always be, you should always turn to the right. It comes from this shtickle line of Gemara over here. Okay. Makam Hayusham Amma. There was a place, there was a tile there that was a cubit by cubit. The rabbis learned. The verse says, go get the dirt, that will be there. Go find the dirt, that will be there. Okay. So I would think, wait, how does this dirt situation work? How does it work? You start digging holes in your floor, but after you dig a few scoops of dirt, what do? You can bring more dirt from inside. So he's trying to figure out what to do. I'm going to finish, I believe, with this stickle Gemara. Yachal, I would think I would think, listen, you arrange your dirt outside and bring it in. Now the dirt's in the temple because the dirt should be in the temple. In other words, from the dirt, that'll be there. Okay, go get dirt from outside and bring it in. Tamalema therefore teaches us the karka hamishkan. It has to be dirt on the floor of the mishkan. Oh, ibekarka mishkan, if on the floor of the mishkan, yachal, I would think, yachbar bakardumais, you should start bringing in your shovels. Can you imagine? Start going there, start digging this massive hole in the ground under the tile. Therefore the verse says, listen, asher yiyah, dirt that will be there. In other words, that's not that important that it has to be like, dirt under the ground. It could get there. Hakate said, what do I mean? How do I do this? Yesham, if there's dirt under the tile, good, just take from the dirt under the tile. Ain sham, if there isn't, tain sham, put it there. Go get dirt from outside, put it there. Now it became part of the dirt of the floor. Don't start digging up deep tunnels under your tile there, but go get dirt, put it on the floor, and then take it from there. So it has to come from the floor, but you could bring outside dirt inside. You have to start digging up the hole underground. Tanya Idach, we learned a little different elsewhere. Umina afar asher yiyah, the verse says from the dirt that will be there. It teaches us that he would prepare it outside and bring it in. However, bekarka hamishkan, because it says the floor of the mishkan. So Isi ben Yehuda Imer, because it says you can't just bring it in from outside, you have to get it from inside the Mishkan. So one person, Isi, the son of Yehuda, says, Lahavi karka. We're going to go to just a few lines on top of the page to include, and Rashi, I believe, skips these words here. Beis Eilamim of the Beis HaMikdash. In other words, to say that you can use the dirt in the Beis HaMikdash. So, and Isi ben Menachem, Isi, the son of Menachem, says, Einay tzarich, you don't have to tell me. In other words, not just the Mishkan dirt is good, but the Beis HaMikdash dirt is also good. In other words, that's why he's adding the words Beis HaMikdash you could get from the dirt of the Mishkan, and it's also okay to get the dirt of the Beis HaMikdash. But Isi ben Menachem, same first name, Isi, but he's the son of Menachem, says no. Einay tzarich. Why would you need to tell me that if you can take dirt from the Mishkan, it's also, and you're telling me it's also good to take dirt of the Beis Hamikdash. Of course, the Beis Hamikdash is good. If with a lighter kind of impurity, the Torah didn't differentiate. What does that mean, a lighter impurity? That it's prohibited to be impure and go into the Beis Hamikdash and go into the tabernacle. Why are you trying to tell me that I could also take dirt from the Beis Hamikdash? We don't see that we generally differentiate between the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan, the tabernacle and the temple. Just like you can't go in impure by touching a dead body, not to the tabernacle, not to the Beis Hamikdash. The Torah didn't differentiate. Tumas Eshes Ish, so too with the impurity of a suspected adulteress, where you're concerned that there was a improper behavior between a Chamura, which is much worse. Like Kol Shekain, for sure, there should not be. Why would you think that there would be a differentiation between the tabernacle and the Beis Hamikdash? To come and say that the Torah has to tell me, the Karka HaMishkan, to tell me that it's including the Beis Hamikdash. And came out to so fine. So then why does the Torah add the words Bekarka HaMishkan, the dirt on the Mishkan? That he shouldn't start bringing from his house. He comes in with a thing of dirt from his house and bring it and bring it there, but that he should, I guess they would take dirt, they would settle it down, if I understand correctly, in the grounds of the Beis Hamikdash, and whenever it came time, they would take, you don't bring your own box of dirt from home. No, they bring dirt from outside, they place it on the floors of the Beis Hamikdash. I guess maybe they would just refill it as soon as they scoop it, and then you take it from the floor of the Beis Hamikdash and you fill it in. But we don't want you bringing it from your house and bringing it into the Beis Hamikdash like that. And that, my friends, is the end of today's Gemara. Perfect timing.